decade. Welcome to another year of the Behavior, Evolution, and Culture speaker series, and hopefully another decade of it. Before we start, a couple announcements. I just want to remind everybody that this speaker series, we meet every Monday of the quarter from noon to 1:30 here. There's a website where you can find the schedule at www.bec.ucla.edu. And I want to take a moment to acknowledge our generous co-sponsors who have provided funding for the speaker series, which include the UCLA Department of Anthropology, the UCLA Center for Society and Genetics, the IRSP Interdisciplinary Relationship Studies Program, the Kotzen Institute of Archaeology. Am I forgetting anything? Okay, that's it for now. So thanks to all of them for helping to keep this running. And we have a great lineup of speakers this quarter. I'll just give you a brief overview. Today we have Adriana Galvin from UCLA Psychology. Next week we will have Lynn Fairbanks. Also from UCLA, Department of Psychiatry and Biobehavioral Sciences. We'll be talking about genetic, maternal, and life history influences on sociability in vervet monkeys. There's a holiday on January 18th, so we won't be having Beck that day, but we will be having a special Beck the Friday before that, on January 15th. Tim Waring from the UC Davis Department of Anthropology talking about
collective action and resource conservation in Tamil.
Okay, so that will be noon, the usual time, but it'll be on Friday the 15th, and I'll send out an announcement about that. Following week is Namir Akhtar from the UC Santa Cruz Department of Psychology on children's learning from third-party interactions. Eric Villain from UCLA Medical School on the 1st of February. His talk is entitled Gaynomics, the Biology of Sexual Orientation. On February 8th, Karen Bales from UC Davis Department of Psychology on Neurobiology of Parenting in Monogamous Species. 15th of February is a holiday. 22nd will be Peter Kim from USC Department of Management and Organization, his talk is entitled The Manifestation of Mob Mentalities. And then there's two more talks we don't have the titles for. Elizabeth Pillsworth, who's now at Cal State Fullerton Department of Anthropology on the 1st of March, and her colleague, Peter Fashing, from the Cal State University Department of Anthropology on the 8th. And we don't have their talk titles left. But that is an overview of what the quarter holds. These are all great talks. And without further ado, it is my great pleasure to introduce Adriana Galvin from the UCLA Department of Psychology, who is going to be talking to us about risk-taking in adolescence.
Thank you. That sounds like a really great list of speakers. I'm a little bit nervous to speak to you all, to be honest, because I want to hear so much about what you all think about adolescence, and I come at it from a neuroscience perspective and trying to understand how what little we know, and more we're knowing a lot more about what we know about how the brain changes during adolescence might relate to these developmental behavioral changes that anecdotally we know so much about. So please stop me. I have written the talk, so it's not quite an hour, so we have a lot of time for questions and really just comments. I want to learn from all of you about what you all think about adolescence and behaviors. So I always like to start talks in trying to define adolescence, and this is something that is a pretty difficult thing to do. How's my sound?
It's good. It's just
my voice is raspy also because I'm...
No, it's great. It's just a little bit about feedback. So
okay.
I'm going to turn it down slightly.
Okay.
Is that?
How's that? Mm-hmm. Yeah? Okay. So adolescence is a really difficult period in development to define because unlike infancy, for instance, we know what an infant is, and there are developmental milestones that we use to define when an infant becomes a toddler, for instance. And But then in middle childhood also we have a pretty defined time in life that we consider middle childhood. But adolescence is a little bit more difficult because the precise onset and offset vary so much by individual. The other reason it's difficult to define is because onset is usually defined as puberty, right? The sexual maturation. But yet offset is more characterized and defined by culturally defined norms. So for instance, the law tells us that an adolescent becomes an adult when they're 18. But we can argue that perhaps 18 is not really an adult by that point. Another way people do it is to define the end of adolescence by financial independence. But that too, that too has really been stretched out, especially in recent years when even college students, certainly, after college students, are still financially dependent, if not on their parents, on some other source. But does that not make them adults, simply because we are, all of us to some extent, are dependent on other sources for income? So, so it's really difficult to define adolescence. The field generally defines it as a gradual period of transition from childhood to adulthood. It's not completely satisfying way to think about adolescence, but it's the best we have. So I think about it as a transition from dependence to independence, but again, that can mean a lot of different things. In this definition, I mean dependence, cognitive dependence, from cognitive dependence to cognitive independence. And I just want to stress that adolescence is not simply puberty. Okay. So in a recent review I was doing, this just to give you an idea about how widespread this issue is, I was doing a review about recent papers on reward and brain development. And what I found is that the age span of adolescence is really broad. So some groups even include 9-year-olds in their adolescent group. And so this is still a relatively new field in which we're still trying to even piece out what we mean by the questions that we're asking. So today I'm mostly going to talk about neural circuitry that changes during adolescence, and the circuitry has been implicated in risk-taking and reward-seeking behaviors. And the reason I'm interested in it in adolescence is because of the dramatic increase in risk-taking behaviors in adolescence. And we can talk more about that. But in my work, I define risk as the possibility that something unpleasant or unwelcome will happen, rather that you do not know the outcome of the behavior that you're engaged in. Conversely, and something that we don't typically talk about so much in adolescent neuro research, is that risk also means a possibility that something good will happen. And this is where the reward component comes in, because engaging in behaviors that are uncertain, for instance, can mean very different things across life. So I would argue that in adolescence, uncertainty is attractive. And perhaps less so, of course there are huge individual differences, but less so as we get older. And as we mature, we're less drawn to uncertain outcomes, or the possibility of uncertainty. So risk-taking peaks during adolescence, and we know this anecdotally from a lot of laboratory studies and observational work, that during adolescence there's a general increase in the amount of risk-taking behavior, or in the perspectives of willingness to engage in risk-taking behaviors. And this is unlike other behaviors like cognitive control or impulsivity and higher cognition that show more linear patterns across development. So typically, as you age and as you become, certain parts of your brain are developing, you're better able to regulate your behavior. and you're better able to appreciate abstract concepts. And so that's a linear change, whereas risk-taking is very different from that, in that it's a non-linear change. So I won't talk so much about this because it's really speculative thoughts about it, but we often try to think about why this might be adaptive. And the answers are pretty obvious and simple, in that risk-taking perhaps facilitates independence. So if the goal of one developmental goal of adolescence is to become independent, it makes sense that you're more willing to engage in behaviors that either you perceive or your culture perceives as gaining independence or marking your independence. It allows individuals to become their own caretakers. And in parentheses I say PFC because I'll talk more about this, but the prefrontal cortex, or PFC, is, as you probably all know, the region of your brain that we consider the adult area that allows us to have higher cognition. And before adolescence, essentially children rely on their parents to be their prefrontal cortex. Your parent is who comes in and regulates your behavior and tells you, don't do that, that's not good, or don't run out in front of the street. As you mature and get more independence, as your prefrontal cortex comes online, you become your own prefrontal cortex. And so engaging in risks and seeking out experiences on your own allows you to strengthen this, this prefrontal activity. Along with this, all of this falls under the idea of facilitating independence. It encourages exploration away from the group. So when we engage in risk-taking behavior, it usually involves peers, friends, activities outside of your family or your comfort group. And risk-taking appears to coincide with a time in which hormones drive adolescents to seek out sexual partners. So in terms of procreation, it makes sense that this is a time when, again, you're exploring different opportunities in your life. And these types of independence-seeking behaviors are prevalent across species. So mice, for instance, spend a lot more time with their peers in their adolescent period. Non-human primates, similarly, start engaging in behaviors that are more separate from their troop. Any questions about this? Okay. But of course, the reason from a public health reason to study this work is that, or this phenomenon, is that risk-taking can be maladaptive. So there's an increased rate of sexual promiscuity in adolescence. There's a higher incidence of drug use initiation and addiction onset. Reckless driving increases dramatically during adolescence. And so these behaviors that, although normative and certainly healthy in certain doses, can set the stage for a much longer, harmful, long-term effects. And so for that reason, it's important to understand how the brain represents this type of behavior. And is it that, well, we can talk about this, but is this going to happen no matter what? Like if you put an adolescent in a closet during this time, is the brain similarly going to represent these types of behaviors or have representations of reward and risk-taking in the same way? Or, and of course it's probably both, the environment changes so dramatically during adolescence that it's an interaction of those two things. So today I'm going to talk mostly about how the brain represents this type of behavior, this increase in reward and risk-taking behavior. And I'll try to make the link of why studying reward is an index for studying risk-taking. Okay, so just a little background on what we know about brain development. So historically, investigators really focused on the early years. So knowing that in the first few years of life, there are a lot of changes in the brain. And the details don't matter, but what this figure is showing is synaptic density, so a measure of synaptic strength or synapses, and age. And this first huge blip is the first few years of life. And investigators really honed in on this idea that there was a surge in the number of synapses. And synapses are, of course, critical for learning, for establishing neural networks. And so we attribute, and we know that there are a lot of changes in synaptic density during the time when you need a lot of neural resources, such as learning to walk and learning to talk. So there are a lot of changes then. And by the way, these data come from morphology studies in non-human primates, and then Huttenlocher did a similar study in postmortem brains. But as you can imagine, there aren't that many postmortem brains, and so it's difficult to acquire these type of data. So more recently, we've started focusing on this other major change in this pattern. And this is during adolescence. And what this is showing is that there's a lot of pruning going on. A lot of the cells that were established early in life are starting to wither away. And the idea is that as you become an adolescent, your brain then starts getting rid of the cells that you don't need. Because every single cell in your brain is always firing, right? And so if you have an excess number of cells, you're having a lot more excitation than you really need. And so during adolescence, the brain starts pruning away neurons that aren't necessary, and instead starts strengthening those that you do engage a lot. And where this pruning happens the most is in the prefrontal cortex. So this figure comes from Jay Gede's group at the NIMH, who's done a lot of work on structural brain development. And it's actually a movie that I won't play you, but what it's showing is that the purple represents a more mature brain, or parts of the brain. And so what it's showing is that this prefrontal region here is doesn't reach maturity until the early 20s and beyond. And so this is the idea is that this is the last brain region to develop, is the prefrontal cortex. Now the prefrontal cortex is necessary for all these higher cognitive functions, including decision-making, planning, goal-directed behavior, controlling your impulses, etc. And so a lot of initial models of adolescent behavior focused on this protracted development of the prefrontal cortex to suggest that adolescents engage in risky behavior because they don't have a fully capable prefrontal cortex. And that idea makes perfect sense, that if you don't have the cognitive or neural resources to control your behavior, perhaps that's why you engage in risky decision making. But of course, that's really a really simplistic view. And risk-taking is not due simply to insufficient knowledge or intellectual abilities. Because if you bring adolescents into the lab, they don't differ from adults in their ability to verbalize the dangers of risky behavior, of their ability to perceive risks, or they don't differ in their feelings of invulnerability, which is often cited as why adolescents engage in these behaviors. Oh, they simply don't feel as vulnerable. Well, these data suggest that it's not true. And so adolescents show the same logical reasoning abilities that adults do in a laboratory, suggesting that it's not that their prefrontal cortex isn't mature enough to help them and support them in understanding the consequences of risky behavior. And so adolescence is really a paradoxical period in development, because on the one hand you have maturational improvements that coincide with the maturation of the prefrontal cortex. You are better able to learn, to appreciate abstract concepts, and you have better analytical reasoning skills during this time. And yet, this is a period in life when the most suboptimal decisions are made. including risk-taking and everything we've talked about. And so there seems to be an imbalance between their ability to appreciate all the consequences of risk-taking and yet their drive or their attraction towards these behaviors anyway. Yeah?
I just want to make sure that I'm following your reasoning, because I think different people use words different ways.
Yeah.
How is optimality defined?
That's a very good question, exactly. And by here, I mean behaviors that we as a society think are optimal. So non-harmful behaviors, or behaviors that are not going to lead to a harmful outcome. Okay? Any other questions? Okay. So Steinberg proposed this model a few years ago, saying that long after adolescents have become as smart as adults. So this is the y-axis shows the percent of adolescents scoring like adults, and here is age on the x-axis. And what he's showing is that intellectual ability in the dark black line is more similar to adults earlier in life relative to psychosocial maturity, which is in the hashed line, the dotted line. And so the idea is that there's this imbalance between the intellectual ability and the psychosocial maturity. When we start thinking about what that means in terms of neural systems that support these behaviors, we know that there are two main systems involved in risky choice and reward processing. We have social emotional regions that typically include limbic region, so this is the front of the brain, this is the back, and this green dot is placed on the ventral striatum and the amygdala regions you've probably heard about before that are really responsive to risk-taking and reward processing. On the other hand, we have the prefrontal cortex that, like I've said earlier, is really necessary for cognitive control. And so you have both of these systems at play when engaging in these types of behaviors. So we have, in this one study I'll talk about, we hypothesized that these systems mature along different timetables across age. So you can imagine that in children, both of these systems are relatively underdeveloped. They're still changing a lot during middle childhood. In adults, you have these systems mostly are mature, prefrontal systems and the ventral striatal systems. However, during adolescence, this is meant to represent the idea that while the prefrontal cortical regions are not fully mature, the subcortical regions are much more engaged. And so if you have an individual who's really responsive to rewards and really responsive to emotion, and yet they don't have the prefrontal cortical capabilities to regulate that, that sensitivity, then you're going to have these risk-taking behaviors. And that's what this model is meant to represent. So, so the ventral striatum is in red, and again, the ventral striatum is the region critical for reward and emotion processing, and this is simply a schematic, of course, and then the prefrontal cortex is not yet as mature as the ventral striatum. Does that make sense? Okay. And that, of course, is very similar to the Steinberg model of psychosocial maturity relative to intellectual ability. Okay. So, one way to study risk-taking is to examine reward systems. And the reason to study reward systems as an index of risk-taking behavior is because rewards take on particular importance during adolescence. So risk-taking is rewarding for adolescents. And so perhaps the idea is that if risk-taking is rewarding for an adolescent, perhaps it's because the reward system is changing so much during this developmental period. Okay. Also, we know from a lot of adult literature that neural systems that are sensitive to risk are also those that are most responsive to reward. So, in this study, this is all in adults. They presented adults with safe choices in the MRI and risky choices in the MRI. And what they found is that the risky choices elicit a lot more activation in the ventral striatum. And the ventral striatum is highly implicated in sensitivity to reward. So if you give any type of rewarding stimulus to a non-human primate, for instance, and then record electrical or neural activity, you'll see a lot of release in a lot of increased activation in the ventral striatum in these animals. Yeah.
Can you give us an example of what would be a contrast between a risky and a safe choice?
Yeah, so in this example, they did like a monetary risk-taking task. So if you're going to bet a certain amount of money, that was considered a risky choice, or if you took a safe option instead.
But the same expected value.
Exactly. Although that, sometimes people manipulate that as well.
Yeah, so that's, sorry, just following up on what Rob said. So then the reward is tightly linked to the risk, right? Because if you, so, is that right?
Well,
or am I,
yeah,
you said the same expected value, I'm sorry, just wanted to clarify.
Right, it can be, because then also, if you have a safe choice, you're also getting that reward for sure. It's either getting a reward for sure, or the chance of a reward.
But the chance of the same reward, or the chance of a bigger reward if you take
People
the
do
risk?
it both ways. In this case, it was the same. It was the same expected value.
So on average, you get the same, but you've got a chance to make some real money from the risky choice, and it's
Right.
a chance to lose some money.
That's exactly right. And that's the other side of it, is that these type of experiments do involve a punishment component as well, because you are asking people to risk, losing money. This is a very similar type of experiment done more recently, and again, we see a lot of activation in the ventral striatum. These different conditions represent the different options that they were given in the scanner, but it's the same idea that right before making a risky choice relative to making a safe choice, the participants recruited a lot more of the ventral striatum relative to the safer choice and relative to other regions in the brain that are important for aversive responding. Yeah.
Can you account for sort of considerable amount of variance in risk-taking behavior through sort of the ventral striatal response to the actual reward? Are they positively correlated? I mean, does the ventral striatal response to receiving the reward itself account for future risk-taking behavior?
They didn't do it in this study, but some data I'm going to talk about later suggests that yes.
So sensitivity directly related
To the risk, yeah.
So I'm just trying to compare this with your definition of risk at the beginning, which was the possibility of bad things happening. Right? So if this part of the brain responds to the possibility of reward, and in, let's call it a gamble rather than the risky choice, just to keep things clearer, right? In the gamble, while the expected value is the same, because the probability of success in the higher risk condition is low, the possibility of a higher reward exists. So how do we know that the ventral striatum is responding to risk and not just to the possibility of the absolute level of reward? I have two choices. One has a higher possibility of absolute reward. That one elicits more response. And then there's nothing in there about the possibility of bad things happening in the way that you define risk really.
Yeah, well, it's a very good point, because let me answer first your question. Because when they do manipulate it for its expected value, they still, when they choose the gamble, they still recruit this region more so, even when the same amount of reward that they will ultimately earn is safe. Okay.
Perhaps the additional data that you're going to show us will clarify.
second thing I was going to say is that I'm really glad you bring this up, because all of us, a lot of us, talk about this, the ventral striatum is a part of the brain that's really sensitive to reward. But that's really a misnomer, because it's a part of the brain that's really sensitive to learning, and to learning outcome contingencies. And in fact, this region also is very responsive to aversive learning, so just as you're suggesting. So if you pair a shock with, you know, whatever an outcome, this part of the brain is also as sensitive. And so I think that what the ventral striatum and the dopamine learning signal is really coding is uncertainty. So when you don't know the outcome of something, whether it's good or bad. And we have simply targeted it as a reward center because the experiments we do involve reward. But when they involve aversive stimuli, it's also similarly engaged.
Yeah, that's quite amazing.
Yeah. Okay, so, what was it with this? Right, so just to show you what I'm talking about, so the ventral tegmental area is rich in dopamine neurons, and when dopamine is released from the ventral tegmental area, and also this is stage nigra actually, the neurotransmitter is released into the nucleus accumbens and also into the prefrontal cortex. So this circuit has been very well delineated using neuroimaging and other methods to examine how it responds to reward and to uncertainty in general. Okay, so that's just another picture of it. Okay, so our first basic question was to understand how reward influences neural function in adolescence. Does this sensitivity change across this developmental period? And there are two debates in the literature suggesting that the ventral striatum and other regions that are sensitive to reward show different patterns of activation. One view suggests that perhaps, so I just told you that in response to reward, mice and non-human primates show an increase in dopamine. And the idea is that one view suggests that if adolescents showed a hyposensitivity, that is, if they weren't releasing as much dopamine, perhaps that drives them to engage in behaviors that are going to elicit more dopamine release, rather reward-seeking behaviors or risk-taking behaviors. The other side is that perhaps the dopamine and ventral striatal system is hypersensitive to reward, so that in response to the same amount of reward, there's less activation of this region. So does the teen brain respond more or less to rewarding experiences than other age groups? So to study this, we were really interested in doing this kind of work in a way that was very passive. So we didn't want, in one experiment we didn't, the other was not passive, but we wanted the adolescent to simply experience the different amounts of reward, and just experience reward. And they did this in the fMRI. So most of you are probably familiar with imaging techniques, so I'll just briefly just remind you that the reason we use it is because it's an indirect measure of brain activity, and it's non-invasive, so we can scan children and adolescents, and it gives us really good spatial resolution in cortical and subcortical regions, so the prefrontal cortical regions as well as this ventral striatal region that we're really interested in. And all the participants that we have are acclimated to the scanner with the SMOC scanner in my lab, so they come in, they play with it, and we make sure they're comfortable, because of course if you have too much movement, you're not going to get good data, or if you have a very anxious child, you're simply going to be scanning the anxiety and not the manipulation that we're interested in. So this child is in the scanner. She gets goggles placed on her, and through the goggles, she's interacting with the computer. So she sees the computer screen. She has a button box at her hands. So when she's being presented with the stimuli, and if she's being asked to respond to it, she does so all while she's lying there in the scanner. Any questions about that? Okay. So in this study that I'm going to describe, it was a very simple child-friendly game in which these are different screenshots of what they see in the scanner. They were presented with a cue on the left or the right side of the fixation cross. After a few seconds, they were asked to respond. They saw it on the left or the right. Very simple, so all age groups could do it. And then, based on their response, if they got it correctly and if, depending on how quickly they responded, they received a reward of small, medium, or large amount of reward. And that was it. That was the manipulation. And they did various trials of this, and then we scanned a group of adolescents, a group of children, and a group of adults.
So the pirate shows up and then there's chests there. Those are just masks, basically.
Yeah.
They would cover up so that you couldn't see which side the pirate was on.
Right. Exactly. Yeah. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. And it's really just basically a cover story because they have to do something or they're going to fall asleep. So we have to have them somehow respond so we know that they're awake in the scanner and on task. But yeah.
I'm just curious, how do you recruit, and are you concerned about that you're not getting representative populations based on where you recruit?
Definitely. I wish that that's exactly the problem, and it's a really self-selected group. So we post flyers everywhere. We have a subject pool of people who have participated in the past.
Post flyers on where?
Oh,
For adolescents. When you're looking for adolescents and children.
Yeah. Well, this study was actually done in New York, but we post them on the subway, grocery stores, Barnes & Noble, etc. And then, of course, we screen out individuals who have either developmental delay or other kind of psychiatric history, illness of psychiatric, or history of psychiatric illness.
You're not just getting kids of professors, though.
No,
Okay.
no, we're
Yeah.
not getting kids and professors. Yeah.
And the reward given in this it's random, whether it's small, medium, or large?
It's random, whether it's small, medium, or large. Oh, and then they actually they get the money they earn after the experiment is done. So we don't tell them how much each amount is worth because when we piloted the study, they were spending all this time trying to figure out how much money they had earned up until that point. It was really distracting because then they'd miss the next trial and weren't paying attention. So when we had it say $1, $2, and $3, it was disruptive. So we made it abstract coins, and that seemed to work better for everyone. And then when they finished, they got the money in addition to their subject payment. Was there another question? Yeah.
So if, when you move to the abstract version, would you say you're studying US or CS then?
I guess the CS, yeah. Other studies have tried to get around this by doing primary rewards. So getting a straw in the scanner and trying to mimic non-human primate studies of working for a drop of juice, for instance. But it's a very challenging manipulation to do in the MRI, especially with children, so we haven't done that, but. Okay. So when we analyze the data, what we see is, of course, what we expected is activation in the nucleus accumbens, this ventral striatal region, and all groups show it, the children, the adolescents, and the adults. But as we were interested in the developmental change in this region, or if there was one, we looked at each group separately. This is percent MR signal, brain activity, children in white, adolescents in blue, and adults in red. And in response to the small reward, these are data when they see just the one coin, the children show the most activity to any type of reward. They're just happy to get the reward, or happy I'm using that as an index of what the ventral striatum is doing. But the adolescent group shows significantly decreased activation to the small reward. And the adults don't show much activity at all when they see the small reward. In contrast, when we take a look at the largest reward, so when they see the biggest pile of coins, the adolescent group shows the greatest activation in this region relative to children and adults. And so these data suggest that in response to the same amount of reward, the adolescent group is showing a much more exaggerated activation. When we first looked at these data, we only looked at the large reward and we thought, okay, well that means that adolescents just represent reward more robustly than the other groups. But what I think is really interesting is that instead there just seems to be this extreme neural response based on the amount of the reward. Yeah.
You show, is the variance different in adolescents than in other categories?
It is. There's more variance in the adolescent group. And I'll show you the variance in a second. But yeah, good question. And also, we started thinking about what this could be, and the small reward, they're getting these stimuli relative to one another. It's all in the same scanning session, so perhaps the small reward is now considered a punishment because of IRB reasons, we couldn't actually take money away from them, and it's whatever. So anyway, so the most they would let us do is do a small, medium, and large amount of reward. And so this could be a relative punishment, and perhaps adolescents are also more sensitive at the neural level to the punishment that they're receiving than the other groups. But does anybody have any ideas about what this is, this pattern of activation? Yeah.
Do you see an intermediate effect with the medium-sized reward?
We do see an intermediate effect, but there are no differences between the groups.
Okay.
So they each show this similar kind of pattern, but there are no significant differences. Mm-hmm.
So one of the things that worries me is that so the adults are making, I don't know, $60,000 a year or something.
Exactly.
And the kids are making.
Yeah, money means different things.
Yeah, so how do you know what scale they're making?
Exactly, we don't. And so in a follow-up study, what we're doing is we're trying to set up something like a, has everyone been to Chuck E. Cheese where you earn tokens and, okay, whatever. Chuck E. Cheese is this, you play games and you earn tickets. And then you cash in your tickets for something that is of certain value to you. And so in that way, we could try to better equate what, the number of tickets for a child and, get, I don't know, but it's a difficult problem of what money means to children. And so we've tried to think of different reinforcers, but similarly, it's really difficult. Mm-hmm.
Have you looked at age as a continuous variable instead of categorical like this?
Mm-hmm.
To sort of get at what you were talking about earlier with the problem of defining adolescence?
Yeah, and I'll show you some data of that in a second. Yeah, so, sorry.
I was just going to ask, what does the 0 represent on the y-axis?
Mm-hmm. So when we do imaging data, mostly the way we acquire these graphs and these data is a contrast. So you're comparing one condition to a different condition. And the 0 here means no difference between those conditions.
Right.
And the contrast in these data are between, for instance, the small reward and that fixation. So between each trial, we have this period of time when all they're doing is looking at the, nothing, the fixation graphs. Also, baseline issues can really influence your data. So an adolescent could be thinking about who knows what compared to an adult. Of course, adults think about weird things too, but you simply can't control what your baseline is in that regard.
Right. So, and are the baselines, I'm just thinking about, because it's an interesting thing, right? You've been talking about how some of these measures of striatum activity are before any action is taken.
Mm-hmm.
So you're saying that this area is active when the opportunity to take a risk is there, but
right.
before they actually experience the outcome.
That's exactly right. And actually, this part of the brain is more recently been defined as something as a neuroregion that codes for prediction error. So is this where you're getting at? Oh.
Yeah, not exactly that, but I was wondering what the, sort of what the psychological experience of the subject is when that fixation
Right,
thing
so
is there, because their brain may be going, okay, something's going to happen.
that's exactly
what's it
right,
gonna
because
be?
we model the data. So the way we do the analysis is that we pick a point in time that we want to study. So for instance, when they see the reward. And what happens with the imaging data is that there's a hemodynamic lag. So if you see this at time 0, we have to, when we do the analysis, consider that it takes 4 to 6 seconds for this neural activation to present itself in the way that we need to see it to do the analysis. Does that make sense? Okay. So these data that I'm showing you were actually modeled at this point. So it's in anticipation of the reward that they're going to get. Oh, and the other thing I didn't say is that, I should have presented these data, but each of these cues, someone asked me earlier if it's random, and what I meant to say is that I didn't mean to not go through it, but each cue was associated with one of those rewards. So they came to learn which cue predicted that reward. And so,
Excuse me, different pirates.
cues meaning different pirates. Sorry.
That's why, like, cue as opposed to just
Exactly. Sorry. And so what happens is that initially, it's actually really interesting. So when we break up the experiment into 5 different runs. So they're in the scanner for about 36 minutes. And what they do is we first model the data to see what happens when they see the reward, right? And we see show the greatest activation in the ventral striatum when they see the reward, accounted for the hemodynamic lag. Eventually, when we look at the data at the end of the experiment, they're responding to the cue, but not to the reward. And it's because they've paired this cue with a particular reward. And so in that way, it's what you're saying, that instead the ventral striatum is responding to the cue that's predicting what's going to come up next. And so extensive work has been done mostly in non-human primates showing that the ventral striatum is really critical for prediction error. And what that means is that it's coding the difference between what you expect and what you actually get. When what you get is better than you expected, you see increased firing, dopamine firing in the ventral striatum. When what you get is worse than you expected, you see depressed activation in this region. And when what you get is what you expected, there's absolutely no response from the system. Which is why by the end of the experiment, they're not responding to this anymore because they already expected it. And if your ventral striatum is there to code for uncertainty, then it shouldn't respond to the reward. Yeah?
Can you explain exactly what you mean by the response? Because they're not
Yeah.
actively doing anything, right? So,
Oh, here?
yeah.
Well, here, yeah, they're pressing a button. They're pressing left or right.
Okay,
And that's
so
just
they
a
are-
filler to get them to have to do something.
And the
Okay.
correct response is to like just match it up.
Yeah, it's
whether
really
the pirate
simple.
is on the left or the right.
Yeah.
Oh.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
And so it doesn't matter which way they press, the probability they reward's the same?
Well, no, if they do happen to press the wrong one, they get a little error message.
Uh-huh.
But that rarely happens. I mean, it's so easy. It
Yeah.
rarely happens.
So the finger's on one side or the other, you have to stay which side
Yeah.
it's on. Gotcha.
There is no risk.
Okay.
And do you know what they think about the distribution of the cues when they start? So,
What do you mean?
well, if they're responding to the anticipation,
Mm-hmm.
right? So, if I thought that most of the rewards were going to be large rewards,
Mm-hmm.
if I was a teenager, that would be what I would think.
Yeah.
At least if it were my teenagers, I'd be sort of optimistic, right? About I would always expect to get the greatest thing, and then I'd be disappointed when the wrong pirate came up.
Right, and that's what I'm saying, that it might be a relative punishment, but
But it depends on what you. So if I thought that was a really rare thing to get the cue that the good a large reward. You know, so I was a pessimist, then I would be disappointed when I got the. So it probably depends on what you think they think about the.
Well, they
what their
don't.
priors
We
are,
think
but-
they don't think anything because we don't tell them what to expect. We just say you're going to see these, and they're in there so long that they learn relatively quickly that.
How many cases do they get? How many trials do they get?
They get, hold on, they're in there 36 minutes.
Oh, yeah, so.
They get a lot of trials.
Yeah.
Well, I can't really sort of know this off the top of my head. I can't, a lot of trials.
Yeah.
Yeah,
So.
hundreds of trials.
Okay.
Yeah. Okay. Anything else? Yeah.
I would have been interested to see for the last trial for you to reverse the reward. Did you ever try that?
We didn't try that, and I really wanted to do that too, but I haven't done that. They were already in there a really long time, and it's hard to get them to stay still for longer.
Do you see the activation pattern moving dorsally as they learn the task? More habitual?
No.
No.
So I'm still a little confused about what the 0 means on the,
Okay.
the chart on the next page.
Okay.
But the next slide. But if you ignore the children
Yeah.
and you just compare the adolescents with the adults,
Mm-hmm.
what you see is a pattern in which you know, people care more about big rewards than they care about small rewards, right?
Yeah.
And one can easily dismiss the children as being, you know, distracted or confused or scared or something else about what's going on in the scanner, right? So unless that 0 means something really significant that I'm not understanding, I don't see what the mystery is when one compares adolescents and adults. I mean, the magnitude of the effect is larger.
Well,
but
that's the thing. It's the magnitude of the effect.
But you need to know the variance to really.
Well, but as Rob said, the money probably means a lot less to the adults than it does to the adolescents.
No, I mean the variance.
You'd be
of the
surprised. I mean,
results.
that I definitely agree with the argument that money means different things, but money's money. Like, we all like money.
No, well, suppose that the average adolescent's income is 1/10 that of the average adult's in your experiment. So, you know, make the reward 10 times as great for the adults, and maybe the magnitude effect disappears.
But then why do they respond so little to the smaller books? That amount of money should be substantial. They ought to care more. They don't know how.
They don't know what the
much money
translation,
they're
what the exchange rate is.
Well, then they don't know what the exchange rate is in the other one.
Yeah, neither do the adults.
No, but they have some prior
But they've got a
presumably.
decreased activation.
Yeah.
That's the 0.
And probably your flyer said something about what the,
Less
you know.
activation.
Yeah, we had to say the base amount that they're going to get.
Yeah, so they understood, you know, something about the state. Right?
And one way to get at what you're suggesting, and it's a really good point, is that this is also true of, you know, there's a disparity in appreciation of money in adolescents as in adults, but also we can extend that argument to people who make no money. What about people who have very low SES relative to people who have very high SES or high income? And so a group by Wolfram Schultz did the study by taking a group of individuals who were low SES or low income and then a high SES group. And what they found are no differences in their sensitivity to a reward experiment in the scanner.
How many subjects did you have in the adolescent and adult group?
15 in each. So that's the other thing. We're limited by the number of people we can have in our study.
Well, I guess I was wondering.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, I mean, one of the reasons I was asking about the
Mhm.
the baseline and how you calculated that is, I mean, can you interpret that as like, since you're subtracting the activation in this area from when they see what they get from the moment of expectation, right? If that's
No.
right.
No,
That's not right.
no, that's not right. Here, we're subtracting the baseline, the fixation.
So that's at that blank place.
Right.
The
that's
weird
like-
thing is, the fixation, if I got this right, the fixation comes after they've gotten the cue, which tells them what they're gonna get.
Thank you for bringing that up. It's, okay, this is a snapshot of what they see, but they're also getting this inter-trial interval, they're getting it before, and we average all the intertrial intervals. Collectively, they all make up the baseline. So it's not a baseline per trial. So we take all the data from, this condition, and then take all the neural data points from the fixation, and then average them together respectively, and then subtract.
Are there significant differences in baselines between adolescents and adults?
I haven't looked at that, but there are some data, more recent data, suggesting that yes, and a lot of what else, different groups have shown different things, but also what matters is heart rate variability. And the reason that matters is because the bold signal that we are using as the index of neural activity is based on blood flow. And that's going to be influenced by heart rate and by all these other physiological factors. So yes, that's recently been a very big problem that people are working on. So that clearly can change the data. Anything else? I'll skip through some.
But that shouldn't invalidate what you said, because that changes it for all.
That's exactly right. It changes it, but it's something that, like I was saying, this kind of work is still relatively. I wouldn't say new, but we're still working out the kinks about things that we previously just kind of ignored because we didn't know how to deal with it. And now we're at the stage where we can ask these more methodological questions and limitations and try to incorporate that into the work. But yeah. Mm-hmm.
One thing that might be, I don't know if it's possible to do with your data, or, but it would be to take samples from earlier in trials and compare them to later in trials.
Yeah, and I did that, but I didn't present it here.
Okay.
But yeah,
and
that's where we see that shift in which stimuli elicit the most activation.
Because early on they don't know what rewards are associated with each cue, and then later on.
Yeah, so early on they respond to the coins. Later on they respond to the pirate.
I feel more comfortable about this if you had actually graphed the intermediate position, so we could see if there is a stepwise increase for the adults and for the adolescents.
Yeah.
Makes me think that there's something funny.
I know, and I do it to simplify it, and I probably have it on here somewhere. I'll pull it up for you just so you can see it. Anything else? Yeah. No? Okay. Okay. I'll try to get. Okay. So here's what we were talking about earlier about how it's become so simplistic to say that these ventral striatal regions are simply responding to rewards. That because dopamine is so prevalent in the ventral striatum and dopamine is responding to reward, that means that this is a reward center. And that's simply not true because of what we were saying earlier, that there's so much else that the ventral striatum is doing. And I think what's important is instead to understand why there is so much change in this region, and not simply to simplify it and say, well, it's because adolescents are more sensitive to reward because their reward system is changing. But instead to think about it as a learning system, a neural system that responds to uncertainty and ambiguity, like we were saying earlier. What I said here. Right, and so this is simply, I'll go through it quickly, but this is data from a recent paper showing that when they pair, these cues with, here they use money. So when they either take money away or nothing happens, the blue square becomes an aversive cue. And again, it's the same thing. You see activation in this ventral striatal region, very similar to the work the same group has done when they do the same cues and same everything, and instead this means earning money. And this is simply to highlight the point that the striatum is responding to aversive learning as much as it is responding to reward learning. The same group also, and what I would love to do, but again, it's difficult ethically to do it, is that they paired it with shock, so that you can get away from the money and the value of money. And shock means, electrical shock means the same thing probably to everyone, but for ethical reasons, of course, it's really difficult to do, especially in children. So we haven't done it, but we would like to. Carrie, don't feel scuttered. But anyway, so another way people do it is they present cues with aversive sounds. So nails on a chalkboard come through the scanner. A screaming child is another way to do it. And again, what's interesting in this study is that these are all these graphs show, well, this one shows neural activation. And what actually elicits the most ventral striatal activity is the negative sounds relative to the positive sounds. And so I think this is a really convincing story of how it's not simply reward, this ventral striatal region, sensitive to, but also aversive, upcoming events that are aversive.
Were those rated independently somehow, or how do we know that they're on? How do we know that the negative things aren't just nastier than the positive things are?
Yeah, I think that was one difficult thing about this. They took it from a standard set of noises, I guess, that have been rated and equated for arousal and all that. But I think that's the thing. Like the positive sounds are like wind chimes. I mean, that's pretty different than nails on a chalkboard.
Well, I mean, it's consistent with this idea of loss aversion that has been measured a million times.
Yeah, exactly.
You care more about losses than gains.
Yeah. Okay, so this is one of the last things I'll talk about. I just want to again stress the point that what I think more that this neural system that is changing so much in adolescence is not simply responding to reward, but also uncertainty. And if we think about what's going on in the adolescent world, there's a lot of uncertainty. And so the system may simply be more engaged more often than it is in other periods of your life, arguably, of course. So this is meant to show you that work by Wolfram Schultz was the first to show that dopamine neurons aren't simply responding to reward, but to uncertainty. So they presented monkeys with 3 different cues, all predicted reward a drop of juice, with different amounts of probability. Do you all know this word? Yeah?
It's not a monkey, it's a horse.
Oh, well, wait, I'm sorry. You guys don't know this stuff. Okay, so, it's a monkey. Is that why everyone was laughing? Ape, whatever. A non-human primate. A baby non-human primate. Okay. So, anyhow, so they presented this organism with different cues. And each cue predicted the reward with different levels of probability. A predicted it with 0%, B with 50% probability of getting the reward, and C with 100% probability. And the cue that elicited the most dopamine activity was the 50%, which directly dispelled the idea that rewards are what elicit the most activation in the dopamine neurons. Does that make sense? Okay. And this is what these data look like. So these are indices of neural activity in the dopamine, in the ventral striatum. So here what you see is that the stimulus comes on here, and then the reward comes on here. And it's difficult to appreciate from far away, but what you can see is that in the 100% condition, once they've learned these cues, the cue that elicits the most activation is the cue that says, you're definitely going to get this reward, right when they see the cue. By the time they get to the reward, they're not eliciting much neural activity at all. Again, suggesting that what dopamine is doing is telling you what's going to happen next. In the cue that predicted 50%, you see a lot of activation at the cue, but you see sustained activation until the point at reward. And then the dopamine neurons stop responding. Not stop responding, but relatively speaking. And so again, the idea is that dopamine neurons are responding to reward, but also and mostly to uncertainty.
But they're not, sorry, when you said they're telling you what is going to happen next.
That's not accurate. Okay. What they're saying, what I'm saying is that they're coding for the sustained, they are having sustained activation until whatever's going to happen happens. Basically, they're remaining online until whatever's going to happen.
Or
Whether
maybe you're aware of the uncertainty or something.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah. Yeah.
That's what I was going to ask. I mean, it seems like you could almost interpret these as that this area is what guides attention.
Yeah. You could.
Right. So I mean, when it's something that's worth paying attention to,
You pay attention. Yeah.
it makes you pay attention to it, and when it's a boring thing that you know what's going to happen, it shuts off.
Yeah. So these data were really fascinating because it really started to move the field forward in thinking not about dopamine as a reward center, but as sustained activity or sustained attention center, or something that is coding for uncertainty, which is the title of their paper. Okay, so this is the last thing I'll say, but just in thinking about what this means for adolescents, if what I and a bunch of other groups have shown is that this system is changing a lot during adolescence, what does it mean that they have heightened sensitivity or heightened neural engagement for uncertainty? Is it because there's so much uncertainty? I don't know, I'd speculate so. Or does there seem to be more uncertainty in the adolescent world because your dopamine is on overdrive and everything seems uncertain? I don't know. But one last study that we're doing now is that we present them with the choice of making a safe choice or a certain choice. We call it a certain choice or an uncertain choice. And it's very similar to what we were talking about earlier with money. It's like it's a gambling game. And we call the certain choice that because they receive $2 for sure, or they can choose the uncertain choice in which they don't know if they're going to make any money. That's the basic premise. And so far, we're still running subjects, but there are no differences in their actual choice behavior. The adolescents and the adults choose the uncertain option with the same number of times, or not significantly different. What is different, though, is that when we compare, again, we're doing the subtraction. So when we subtract the certain choices from the uncertain choices, there's a lot more activation in the striatum. This is a little bit more dorsal. In the adolescent group, relative to the adults. And conversely, when we subtract the uncertain choice from the certain choice, we see a lot more activation in the adult group. So there does, and I still don't know what this means, but there does seem to be differences in the way the adult relative to the adolescent brain represents certain and uncertain choices. That was a mouthful, so.
But it looks like the bigger effect is that you get a lot more activation by both groups when you subtract the uncertain from whatever that second one is with all that, right? I mean, to me, it looks like I don't know anything about what these things mean, right? But it looks to me like the biggest effect is not that there's more red than blue on the right one than the left one, but then you have a lot more stuff going on the right one than the left one, which is a different thing than what you're saying, right?
Yeah, but so the main point isn't so much how much activity there is at all, but where there is a difference in that activity. So this is a little bit complicated because we're subtracting one condition from another and then also subtracting one group from another group. Does that make
Makes sense. I'm not clear as to why that's
Why I'm confused about the differences. What? So we have uncertain versus certain, and we have certain versus uncertain. I can't understand why they're
Okay.
different.
Okay. Okay. So if we think about all right. If we think about a donut, let's just say a filled donut, a jelly donut, has amount of activation. What we're doing is taking, if that represents brain activity, we're subtracting, we're taking out the little hole to make a donut. Does that make sense? That amount of activation, so that what you're left with is the whole. And that's what this represents. Like, what's the activation when you subtract the certain choice activation from the uncertain choice activation?
Weren't they just the negative of each other?
Yeah, that's, but I understand why they're not the same in these two brains.
So it's x minus y or y minus x. So why isn't that?
But
I think there is a positive part there. She doesn't go below 0. She takes one from the other, but if it doesn't
and remember that this is also subtracting groups.
Yeah, but it's still.
But in one set and not in the other, but no.
Okay.
Okay, well, I don't know how else to explain it, but you got me.
I'm just trying to link this to the larger theme of the talk. Saying that neurons that are dependent on a particular neurotransmitter are more responsive to uncertainty at one life stage than another doesn't necessarily lead to the prediction that individuals who have such neurons should seek out uncertainty, right? So suppose that, let's leave neurons behind and take olfaction. And there are differences between individuals and how sensitive their olfactory systems are, right? To say that an individual who has a highly sensitive system is more responsive to smells is analogous to saying that, particular life stage people have ventral striatum or, whatever brain part you want to choose that's more responsive to uncertainty. The fact that someone is more responsive to smells doesn't mean that we would expect them to pursue behaviors that have a substantial probability of an aversive outcome, which is the way that you define risk to begin with, right? So you might think that the person who is more sensitive to smells is much less likely to go to the dump or the pit porta potties at the Rose Parade, just to choose a recent example, right, at the end of the parade, than the person who is less sensitive, right? It's not clear that because, they might be more likely to go to the bakery and less likely to go to the porta potty, right? And yet you defined adolescent behavior in terms of the big puzzle being why people do things that, from an adult perspective, seem illogical because they have a high probability of an unfortunate outcome.
I also said possibility of a fortunate outcome. It's not knowing that's how we define risk.
No, because adolescents play chicken with cars and Russian roulette and a bunch of other things, right? And the good outcome is not being dead.
But the good outcome in that situation is being socially accepted, and that's what I mean by there's a possibility of something good happening. So the goals that drive an adolescent to play chicken are very different. Like, they're thinking about something very different than you and I would think of.
Then what you're saying is that they're more responsive to a certain class of rewards than adults are, and it's not about uncertainty. Because if all they wanted to do was experience more uncertainty because they get more dopamine hits when they encounter uncertainty, then they should engage in all kinds of behaviors, some positive, some negative, or arguably they should engage in less because it's not clear that having a bigger response.
Right. Well, that's the argument, right? Is it more or is it less? And that's something that we're struggling with. Is the idea that they receive more dopamine engagement or ventral striatum engagement from something? Is it because it's more or is it because it's less? That's an empirical question, right?
But you showed us earlier results that, as Rob said, are entirely consistent with prospect theory or negativity bias or general, a whole bunch of general findings in psychology that negative outcomes are more salient and are stronger motivators or elicit stronger responses than positive outcomes. If it were the case that the volume is just turned up on adolescents, given that pattern, we would expect them to be risk averse and not risk prone.
Maybe.
So, I mean, I think that there's, the findings are interesting, but there's a gap in connecting greater dopamine activity in this brain region with risk prone.
Right. Well, that's what I was saying earlier, that we don't know, and of course we can't say with these data, is it because, maybe it's because there are more opportunities for uncertainty, that when they're presented with uncertainty in the lab, it's simply an experience effect. They have more experience with it at that point in their lives.
We know that there are already strong temperamental differences in the likelihoods of children from early childhood on up to be cautious and vigilant versus bold and exploratory, for example, or have very strong attentional, sustaining attention versus low, and so on. So your data are cross-sectional, so I wonder if you could talk about the longitudinal question, which is the rank order in the very large differences across development, including in adulthood, on those dimensions conserved as you move from one developmental stage to the other, since the amount of variance accounted for by the differences that already exist in the population could very well be larger than the differences that you're showing here.
Yeah, I would love to do that. There have been no longitudinal studies at all with functional imaging. There have been some with structural, but that doesn't really get at this question. And it's really a methodological, economic limitation. It's really expensive, and no one's been able to do it. But certainly, everyone would love to.
But what's your developmental hypothesis about it? Because many have argued that they're conserved.
I would argue that they're conserved also. And I think that the person who's going to engage these systems more as an adolescent is still going to do so as an adult.
I just want to interject for a second.
Yeah.
We have until 1:30, and maybe
I
want to give you time to finish, to get to your, I don't know how much more you
I don't
have
that much. I was going to show the individual differences and stuff, but I mean, it doesn't matter to me.
Sure, that would be great.
Okay.